Chapter 3 describes what is meant by the prayer of recollection which the Lord generally grants before that already mentioned, speaks of its effects and of the remaining effects of the former kind of prayer which had to do with the consolations given by the Lord. The effects of this kind of prayer are numerous. Some of them I shall explain. First of all, I will say something, though not much, as I have dealt with it elsewhere, about another kind of prayer, which almost invariably begins before this one. It is a form of recollection which also seems to me supernatural, for it does not involve remaining in the dark or closing the eyes, nor is it dependent upon anything exterior. A person involuntarily closes his eyes and desires solitude, and without the display of any human skill, there seems gradually to be built for him a temple in which he can make the prayer already described. The senses and all external things seem gradually to lose their hold on him, while the soul, on the other hand, regains its lost control. It is sometimes said that the soul enters within itself, and sometimes that it rises above itself, but I cannot explain things in that kind of language, for I have no skill in it. However, I believe you will understand what I am able to tell you, though I may perhaps be intelligible only to myself. Let us suppose that these senses and faculties, the inhabitants, as I have said, of this castle, which is the figure that I have taken to explain my meaning, have gone out of the castle, and for days and years have been consorting with strangers to whom all the good things in the castle are abhorrent. Then, realizing how much they have lost, they come back to it, though they do not actually re-enter it, because the habits they have formed are hard to conquer. But they are no longer traitors, and they now walk about in the vicinity of the castle. The great king, who dwells in the mansion within this castle, perceives their goodwill, and in his great mercy desires to bring them back to him. So, like a good shepherd, with a call so gentle that even they can hardly recognize it, he teaches them to know his voice, and not to go away and get lost, but to return to their mansion. And so powerful is this shepherd's call that they give up the things outside the castle which had led them astray, and once again enter it. I do not think I have ever explained this before as clearly as here. When we are seeking God within ourselves, where he is found more effectively and more profitably than in the creatures, to quote St. Augustine, who, after having sought him in many places, found him within, it is a great help if God grants us this favor. Do not suppose that the understanding can attain to him merely by trying to think of him as there. This is a good habit and an excellent kind of meditation, for it is founded upon a truth, namely that God is within us. But it is not the kind of prayer that I have in mind, for anyone, with the help of the Lord, you understand, can practice it for himself. What I am describing is quite different. These people are sometimes in the castle before they have begun to think about God at all. I cannot say where they entered it, or how they heard their shepherd's call. It was certainly not with their ears, for outwardly such a call is not audible. They become markedly conscious that they are gradually retiring within themselves. Anyone who experiences this will discover what I mean. I cannot explain it better. I think I have read that they are like a hedgehog or a tortoise withdrawing into itself, and whoever wrote that must have understood it well. These creatures, however, enter within themselves whenever they like, whereas with us it is not a question of our will. It happens only when God is pleased to grant us this favor. For my own part, I believe that, when His Majesty grants it, He does so to people who are already leaving the things of the world. I do not mean that people who are married must actually leave the world. They can do so only in desire. His call to them is a special one, and aims at making them intent upon interior things. I believe, however, that if we wish to give His Majesty free course, He will grant more than this to those whom He is beginning to call still higher. Anyone who is conscious that this is happening within himself should give God great praise, for He will be very right to recognize what a favor it is, and the thanksgiving which He makes for it will prepare Him for greater favors. One preparation for listening to Him, as certain books tell us, is that we should contrive not to use our reasoning powers, but to be intent upon discovering what the Lord is working in the soul. For if His Majesty has not begun to grant us absorption, I cannot understand how we can cease thinking in any way which will not bring us more harm than profit, although this has been a matter of continual discussion among spiritual persons. For my own part, I confess my lack of humility, but their arguments have never seemed to me good enough to lead me to accept what they say. One person told me of a certain book by the saintly Fray Peter of Alcantara, for a saint I believe he is, which would certainly have convinced me, for I know how much he knew about such things. But we read it together, and found that he says exactly what I say, although not in the same words. It is quite clear from what he says that love must already be awake. It is possible that I am mistaken, but I base my position on the following reasons. First, in such spiritual activity as this, the person who does most is he who thinks least and desires to do least. What we have to do is to beg like poor and needy persons coming before a great and rich emperor, and then cast down our eyes in humble expectation. When, from the secret signs He gives us, we seem to realize that He is hearing us, it is well for us to keep silence, since He has permitted us to be near Him, and there will be no harm in our striving not to labor with the understanding, provided, that we are able to do so. But if we are not quite sure that the King has heard us or sees us, we must not stay where we are like ninnies, for there still remains a great deal for the soul to do when it has stilled the understanding. If it did nothing more, it would experience much greater aridity, and the imagination would grow more restless because of the effort caused it by cessation from thought. The Lord wishes us rather to make requests of Him and to remember that we are in His presence, for He knows what is fitting for us. I cannot believe in the efficacy of human activity in matters where His Majesty appears to have set a limit to it and to have been pleased to reserve action to Himself. There are many other things in which He has not so reserved it, such as penances, works of charity, and prayers. These, with His aid, we can practice for ourselves as far as our miserable nature is capable of them. The second reason is that all these interior activities are gentle and peaceful, and to do anything painful brings us harm rather than help. By anything painful, I mean anything that we try to force ourselves to do. It would be painful, for example, to hold our breath. The soul must just leave itself in the hands of God and do what He wills it to do, completely disregarding its own advantage and resigning itself as much as it possibly can to the will of God. The third reason is that the very effort which the soul makes in order to cease from thought will perhaps awaken thought and cause it to think a great deal. The fourth reason is that the most important and pleasing thing in God's eyes is our remembering His honor and glory and forgetting ourselves and our own profit and ease and pleasure. And how can a person be forgetful of himself when he is taking such great care about his actions that he dare not even stir or allow his understanding and desires to stir, even for the purpose of desiring the greater glory of God or of rejoicing in the glory which is His? When His Majesty wishes the working of the understanding to cease, He employs it in another manner and illumines the soul's knowledge to so much higher a degree than any we can ourselves attain, that He leads it into a state of absorption in which, without knowing how, it is much better instructed than it could ever be as a result of its own efforts, which would only spoil everything. God gave us our faculties to work with, and everything will have its due reward. There is no reason, then, for trying to cast a spell over them. They must be allowed to perform their office until God gives them a better one. As I understand it, the soul whom the Lord has been pleased to lead into this mansion will do best to act as I have said. Let it try, without forcing itself or causing any turmoil, to put a stop to all discursive reasoning, yet not to suspend the understanding, nor to cease from all thought, though it is well for it to remember that it is in God's presence and who this God is. If feeling this should lead it into a state of absorption, well and good, but it should not try to understand what this state is, because that is a gift bestowed upon the will. The will, then, should be left to enjoy it, and should not labor except for uttering a few loving words, for although in such a case one may not be striving to cease from thought, such cessation often comes, though for a very short time. I have explained elsewhere the reason why this occurs in this kind of prayer. I am referring to the kind which I began to explain in this mansion. With it I have included this prayer of recollection, which ought to have been described first, for it comes far below the consolations of God already mentioned, and is indeed the first step towards attaining them. For in the prayer of recollection it is unnecessary to abandon meditation and the activities of the understanding, when, instead of coming through conduits, the water springs directly from its source, the understanding checks its activity, or rather the activity is checked for it when it finds it cannot understand what it desires, and thus it roams about all over the place like a demented creature, and can settle down to nothing. The will is fixed so firmly upon its God that this disturbed condition of the understanding causes it great distress. But it must not take any notice of this, for if it does so, it will lose a great part of what it is enjoying. It must forget about it and abandon itself into the arms of love, and His Majesty will teach it what to do next. Almost its whole work is to realize its unworthiness to receive such great good, and to occupy itself in thanksgiving. In order to discuss the prayer of recollection, I passed over the effects or signs to be observed in souls to whom this prayer is granted by God our Lord. It is clear that a dilation or enlargement of the soul takes place, as if the water proceeding from the spring had no means of running away, but the fountain had a device ensuring that, the more freely the water flowed, the larger became the basin. So it is in this kind of prayer, and God works many more wonders in the soul, thus fitting and gradually disposing it to retain all that He gives it. So this gentle movement and this interior dilation cause the soul to be less constrained in matters relating to the service of God than it was before, and give it much more freedom. It is not oppressed, for example, by the fear of hell, for, though it desires more than ever not to offend God, of whom, however, it has lost all servile fear, it has firm confidence that it is destined to have fruition of Him. A person who used to be afraid of doing penance lest he should ruin his health now believes that in God he can do everything, and has more desire to do such things than he had previously. The fear of trials that he was wont to have is now largely assuaged, because he has a more lively faith, and realizes that, if he endures these trials for God's sake, His Majesty will give him grace to bear them patiently, and sometimes even to desire them, because he also cherishes a great desire to do something for God. The better he gets to know the greatness of God, the better he comes to realize the misery of his own condition. Having now tasted the consolations of God, he sees that earthly things are mere refuse. So, little by little, he withdraws from them, and in this way becomes more and more his own master. In short, he finds himself strengthened in all the virtues, and will infallibly continue to increase in them, unless he turns back and commits offences against God. When that happens, everything is lost, however far a man may have climbed towards the crest of the mountain. It must not be understood, however, that all these things take place because once or twice God has granted a soul this favor. It must continue receiving them, for it is from their continuance that all our good proceeds. There is one earnest warning which I must give those who find themselves in this state, namely, that they exert the very greatest care to keep themselves from occasions of offending God. For as yet the soul is not even weaned, but is like a child beginning to suck the breast. If it be taken from its mother, what can it be expected to do but die? That, I am very much afraid, will be the lot of anyone to whom God has granted this favor if he gives up prayer, unless he does so for some very exceptional reason, or unless he returns to it quickly, he will go from bad to worse. I am aware how much ground there is for fear about this, and I have been very much grieved by certain people I know, in whom I have seen what I am describing. They have left him who, in his great love, was yearning to give himself to them as a friend, and to prove his friendship by his works. I earnestly warn such people not to enter upon occasions of sin, because the devil sets much more store by one soul in this state than by a great number of souls to whom the Lord does not grant these favors. For those in this state attract others, and so they can do the devil great harm, and may well bring great advantage to the Church of God. He may see nothing else in them except that His Majesty is showing them especial love, but this is quite sufficient to make him do his utmost to bring about their perdition. The conflict, then, is sterner for such souls than for others, and if they are lost, their fate is less remediable. You, sisters, so far as we know, are free from these perils. May God free you from pride and vainglory, and grant that the devil may not counterfeit these favors. Such counterfeits, however, will be recognizable, because they will not produce these effects, but quite contrary ones. There is one peril of which I want to warn you, though I have spoken of it elsewhere. I have seen persons given to prayer fall into it, and especially women, for, as we are weaker than men, we run more risk of what I am going to describe. It is this: some women, because of prayers, vigils, and severe penances, and also for other reasons, have poor health. When they experience any spiritual consolation, therefore, their physical nature is too much for them, and as soon as they feel any interior joy, there comes over them a physical weakness and languor, and they fall into a sleep which they call spiritual, and which is a little more marked than the condition that has been described. Thinking the one state to be the same as the other, they abandon themselves to this absorption, and the more they relax, the more complete becomes this absorption, because their physical nature continues to grow weaker. So they get it into their heads that it is arrobamiento, or rapture, but I call it abobamiento, foolishness, for they are doing nothing but wasting their time at it and ruining their health. One person was in this state for 8 hours. She was not unconscious, nor was she conscious of anything concerning God. She was cured by being told to take more food and sleep, and to do less penance, for though she had misled both her confessor and other people, and quite involuntarily deceived herself, there was one person who understood her. I believe the devil would go to any pains to gain such people as that, and he was beginning to make good progress with this one. It must be understood that, although when this state is something that really comes from God, there may be languor, both interior and exterior, there will be none in the soul, which, when it finds itself near God, is moved with great joy. The experience does not last long, but only for a little while. Although the soul may become absorbed again, yet this kind of prayer, as I have said, except in cases of physical weakness, does not go so far as to overcome the body or to produce in it any exterior sensation. Be advised then, and if you experience anything of this kind, tell your superior, and relax as much as you can. The superior should give such persons fewer hours of prayer, very few indeed, and should see that they sleep and eat well until their physical strength, if it has become exhausted, comes back again. If their constitution is so weak that this does not suffice, they can be certain that God is not calling them to anything beyond the active life. There is room in convents for people of all kinds. Let anyone of this type, then, be kept busy with duties, and let care be taken that she is not left alone very much, or her health will be completely ruined. This sort of life will be a great mortification to her, but it is here that the Lord wishes to test her love for him, by seeing how she bears his absence, and after a while he may well be pleased to restore her strength. If he is not, her vocal prayer and her obedience will bring her as much benefit and merit as she should have obtained in other ways, and perhaps more. There may also be some who are so weak in intellect and imagination, I have known such, that they believe they actually see all they imagine. This is highly dangerous, and perhaps we shall treat of it later, but no more shall be said here, for I have written at great length of this mansion, as it is the one which the greatest number of souls enter. As the natural is united with the supernatural in it, it is here that the devil can do most harm, for in the mansions of which I have not yet spoken, the Lord gives him fewer opportunities. May he be for ever praised. Amen.